I'm from the Communications and New Media Department, and I'm chairing the session. So our first speaker of today in this session is Itty Abraham. He's the head of the Department of Southeast Asian Studies, and some of his research interests include refugees and displacement and geopolitics. And with that, I will hand it over to Itty.
Thank you. Thanks, Lance. Too low, right?
Yes, very low.
Thank you, Lance, and thank you all for coming. Special thanks to Prof. Gangu for taking time to be here. I'm presenting work that I'm working on right now, so I'll be glad to take all your questions because I think anything that you ask me will help me understand how you understand what I'm saying. So, feel free to interrupt whenever you want. I should also say that, we don't often talk about why we do certain projects. And I feel in this project it's important to give a little bit of background in terms of why I think this is a project worth doing. I began it a number of years ago, but I think the driving force came around 2015 when, if you remember the news from that time, there were flotillas or boats full of migrants from North Africa going across the Mediterranean, and there was a huge response in Europe. So countries like Hungary, for example, created new boundaries and barriers, barbed wire, to prevent people from going through or pushing them on towards Germany. Germany was the one country that responded, I would think, with a degree of humanity and opened their doors to about 1 million people, something that Angela Merkel, I think, has never got the appropriate credit for. In fact, she paid a huge price for it politically at home. But nonetheless, that's the kind of response that I'm actually most interested in. Both the humanity and the openness and the warmth or sanctuary that she offered people who were asylum seekers, people in need of assistance. At the same time, the huge reaction from European countries which made it appear as if the entry of a few people from North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East was going to destroy their countries altogether. So in a sense, it's caught between these two poles. One is the openness and the willingness and the compassion with which countries or leaders approach those who are in need, simultaneously with the political reaction on the ground, the rise of right-wing parties, which says that these are sort of a body threat to the body politic and it must be stopped or it must be suppressed as far as possible. Now, the European case, in a sense, I want to argue, has always been the exception. So even though European countries and the US wrote the original Refugee Convention in 1951, I want to suggest that from the beginning, their response or their way of thinking about refugees has always been the exception, not the rule. So if we go back to 1951, go back to the period when the original refugee, and I'll get to these in a second because I'll just feel I'll give you a little bit of background. Oh, let me put it this way. So we've got the European case, which I've already mentioned. And when we think more recently to what happened in Bangladesh, a country that, as you know, does not have a huge amount of resources, but is at the same time a country that borders Myanmar, which is the primary refugee-producing country, you might say, in Southeast Asia. In a remarkably short period of time, between 500,000 and 700,000 refugees crossed the border from Myanmar into Bangladesh looking for refuge. Now, the reaction in Bangladesh was in marked contrast to what we saw in Europe. So if the European countries all responded with fear and with anxiety and with dread, Bangladesh's response was not a happy one, in the sense nobody is pleased when 500,000 refugees show up on your doorstep expecting refuge. But at the same time, their response was not to turn them away, not to reject them, not to suggest that their country was going to collapse, but to absorb them and to find ways of dealing with them. They use their own resources, they use NGO resources, they use international resources, and to this day we have the largest refugee camp in the world, now on the hills of Cox's Bazar, which is the southernmost part of Bangladesh, and they're there probably to stay. Now, I want to set this in larger context, this question of inclusion versus exclusion, compassion versus rejection in a larger context. And I want to turn back to the origins of the Refugee Convention, which is the primary international instrument that deals with the question of refugees, the primary international treaty that deals with refugees in the current world. In 1951, when the Refugee Convention was written, it was deliberately written in order to exclude anybody who was not European and anyone who had not been affected by World War II, as they defined it. It was explicitly written with those terms into it. In 1967, those terms were changed, but think back to 1951. You've got a continent, Asia, which is going through enormous turmoil. You've had massive wars in China for over 25, 30 years at that point. You've got an Indian subcontinent which is suffering from partition, 10 million people going in either direction. You've got an Indonesia which is suffering from the response of Japanese occupation. You've got a refugee, you've got a war breaking out in Vietnam which is looking for independence, and on and on and on. People estimate that no less than 30 to 50 million people were displaced, forcibly, were affected at that time. And yet you get a convention, a treaty written in Geneva, which excludes all of them from consideration. So ever since that time, we've had, in a sense, two worlds. You've had a world in which the treaty exists and is covered by legal international law, but yet where the restrictions on entry make it a system which is designed to exclude rather than include. You've got another part of the world where the bulk of the world's refugees live, which is not covered by international law, which typically does not have domestic law also covering refugees, but where inclusion is very much part of the history of those countries. So whether we think of Indonesia, whether we think of Malaysia, whether we think of Pakistan, all of these countries have absorbed hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of refugees over the course of the last 50 years. So my project, in a sense, begins from this dilemma or this contradiction. Those who are obliged to do it by law don't do it. Those who have no legal obligations are much more welcoming. That's where I start from. That's what I'm trying to understand. Now, one more point I'd like to make. In the 1960s, which is when most countries in Asia and Africa were becoming independent, they wrote new treaties covering their regions, which were designed to address the question of refugees. And it became, in a sense, a set of regional compacts, which are some case binding, some case not binding, but which had a much more open and inclusive definition of the refugee. Now, I won't say more about that at that time, other than to hint that there's a different process taking place in Asia and Africa, and that's, in a sense, what I'm trying to figure out. Now, I want to introduce then this idea of informal hospitality. So what I want to say is that even in the absence of a legal structure, even in the absence of a legal framework offering protection and sanctuary to refugees, there have been systems in place on the ground involving non-governmental actors, involving civil society, which have been far more inclusive. Don't know how to talk about this other than to put it in terms of hospitality. Now, it's a complicated word. And again, the mention of Derrida, who's a well-known French theorist, is a way, in a sense, of highlighting this issue. In the studies that Derrida has done on hospitality, which are well known and everybody cites them, he always makes a point of going back to the root of the word. So hospitality comes from the word hospice, H-O-S-P-E-S, which in a sense has two meanings. One is stranger, to whom a certain degree of inclusion is permitted, and the other is the root of the word hostility, which offers the idea of a threat or danger. And he, according to him, hospitality in the Western context has always been caught between this double meaning. On the one hand, the idea of a stranger who deserves a certain degree of attention. On the other hand, this stranger can easily become an enemy or a danger or a threat, and hence needs rejection or needs to be controlled in some way. Very quickly, I'm going to run through the rest of it because I'm running out of time. I want to offer a different meaning to hospitality than Derrida does, which starts from language, if you will. I want to start from the actual practices on the ground, looking at what takes place in Malaysia and Indonesia. And here I just want to remind you of the famous case that I'm sure a number of you remember, of when Rohingya refugees were found off the coast of Aceh. And fishermen from Aceh went out and protected them and took them in because their boats were leaking, and gave them asylum, gave them sanctuary for a number of months before they left and went on to Malaysia. And when asked later, why had you done this, or what made you do this, they said two things. One was that they had suffered enormous humanitarian damage as a result of the tsunami, and as a result they felt an obligation to others because they had benefited from others' help. Hence there was a reciprocity at a global level or at a regional level that they had to respond to. And secondly, they said the code, the adab, the local custom of fishermen is always to look after those who have trouble at sea. So in a sense, it's not a code that comes necessarily from law or from the governments themselves, but rather it's an everyday code of conduct, which in a sense governs the actions of these people. So I want to take these ideas seriously. I want to say that even if it's not codified in a legal sense, in a formal sense, it's something that actually changes actions on the ground, and that's why it's so important. Most refugees today in Southeast Asia live not in camps, but rather in detention centers or in cities. So my focus particularly is going to be on the informal sector of cities, where in a sense people lie outside the legal structure, outside the economic framework, but nonetheless find a way of surviving. The kind of protection that they're going to receive in those spaces is not always a good one. It can be exploitative, it can be harmful, they can live in very dangerous settings, but nonetheless they are not rejected, they're not sent back. The main agents that I'm interested in looking at are civil society, religious charities, NGOs, and international relief agencies. Okay? So that's the project in its broadest sense, largest sense. There's one particular piece of it, I'll end in a second, that I realized in a sense there was a huge gap of knowledge about as a result of going through this material and understanding what happened, which is to look at the Indochina crisis of the mid-70s to the mid-80s and understand Southeast Asian government's role in dealing with two simultaneous problems. One was Cambodia and the invasion of Cambodia by Vietnam. The other was the flood of Indochinese refugees from the larger region leaving the area and looking for asylum all over the world. And of course, one of the places they ended up in is not far from here, is Pulau Galang in the Riau archipelago, where there was a camp set up there that had people there for over 15 years. So let me stop there, and thank you for listening. Yep, questions?
Yes, let's open the floor to questions. Seed the discussion. So it seems to me that the comparison between what goes on in Europe and what goes on in Southeast Asia is just rife with difficulties that I'm sure you appreciate. But one of those, it seems to me to be that, especially like you talked about in Bangladesh with the Rohingya coming over, I don't see how a developed country like Germany has literally the geographical space to do something like that, to host 500,000 people in a space. So it seems like maybe at that level it would be impossible. Maybe I don't understand the geography of Bangladesh, maybe they don't have any more space, but just physically, isn't there an issue and also with developed countries, the idea of having 500,000 people sort of ring-fenced in a country would just doesn't make sense. So they have to absorb them in a way that in fact Bangladesh hasn't. I mean, what do you see with these contradictions and comparisons between those regions?
Yeah. In the end, I'm not actually going to do a comparison of the two. I really was pointing to that as my starting point, to say that why is it so different? Why are the responses so different in these two different places? Germany may appear crowded, but when compared to Bangladesh, it's an open zone. Okay? Bangladesh is one of the most densely populated countries in the world, and especially in the southern region around Chittagong, it's pretty bad. So not only are they resource-wise less endowed than Germany, they have less space as well within which to do this, and yet they're doing it. So to me, it only reinforces the point of under no circumstances should they be doing this, yet they are. They don't have the money, they don't have the place, and yet they do it, right? Germany has the money and the place, and we can decide what's an appropriate amount of space. But let's just think of Australia for a second. Australia, I think, for the most part, is empty, right? And yet, what do they do when people come looking for asylum? They place them offshore in Nauru, Christmas Island, even Papua New Guinea, in a sense paying for people to remain offshore while they decide what to do with them. If it is a question just of space or just of resources, Australia would be a prime case for taking in a couple of million every year, and it would be fine. It's what, 20 million population? But they don't. So, something else is taking place there. And it's not so much a question of, and there's plenty of good people in Australia who are very concerned about this and who want to be more accommodating, more hospitable. But governments don't always think like that. And so we have to try and understand what is making governments do that. Even as I don't want to be romantic about governments. So Malaysia and Indonesia are good examples actually, where even though they've absorbed all these different refugees from all over the world, including Bosnians, including Syrians, including more recently Rohingyas, they don't give them legal standing. Right? They don't let them work officially. So they inevitably end up in the informal sector. Now there's a crisis in the refugee regime right now. If you apply as an asylum seeker to UNHCR, your case is not going to be heard for 7 years. What that means is for 7 years, you're going to be living in a place without resources, looking and hoping that you're going to be given refugee status, which gives you a few benefits and which may make you eligible for resettlement somewhere else if you don't go back home. But effectively, you're going to settle locally. You're going to become a local person. But a local person without status, a local person without resources, other than what you can mobilize through your community. And so what you get is the position of the irregular migrant, which is the only category in a sense that people recognize, and the asylum seeker have now been joined. That's the situation that we're in right now. So no, I think Germany did fine. I'm happy to give them credit for doing that. But there's plenty of other countries that could do better. And they're obliged by law to do so.
Good.
Why? Prof?
May I ask you the question that you asked earlier on about language?
Yeah.
Local languages, how do they distinguish between migrant, refugee, and what's the third word you use?
Asylum seeker.
Asylum seekers. How do they distinguish? Do they have this sharp lines between them?
Because there's no law governing asylum seekers in most Southeast Asian countries, Philippines and Cambodia are the exceptions, the term ends up being irregular migrant. So they get lumped into the category of people who don't have the right to be there. Even as you, for example, in a practical setting where you're an asylum seeker and UNHCR has said, we have recorded you as an asylum seeker, they give you a card. And you can show that card to, say, a local policeman who says, who are you and what are you doing? But the local policeman is under no obligation to respect that card as attributing rights to you. He can treat you either as an asylum seeker and therefore just let you go, or he can treat you as an irregular migrant and lock you up. Those are really the two options in a sense.
What's the local word for refugee?
I'm not sure what the local word for refugee is, but the point is it has no legal standing. Because a refugee is only somebody who has gone through a series of adjudications by the UNHCR, UN High Commission for Refugees, which converts your status from asylum seeker, somebody who is looking for asylum, to somebody who is officially now a refugee and therefore eligible for certain kinds of protection from the international community. So actually I think of the refugee now as a very privileged category of asylum seeker. To adopt the old Leninist line, sort of the highest stage of displacement is the refugee. I mean, it's a serious matter, and I'm making fun of it, but it's the only way, in a sense, to understand these different categories and degrees of what it means to be excluded.
We have a question over there?
If there's other questions from the audience, I can.
No, go ahead.
No, I know you're not interested in the comparison.
Yeah. No, I am interested, but yeah, it's not my main point.
Well, so I guess it would be nice to have a comparison with Turkey, for example, just to see how the co-ethnic aspect of this plays in.
Yeah.
So that's one point. Second point is, I know you don't like political science anymore. There's a very.
I was trained as a political scientist, so he's cracking a joke in my expense.
But there's a very interesting literature there about informal institutions, the relationship between formality and informality that we could tap into. And the third point is this also, I was thinking of Partha Chatterjee's idea of political society.
Yeah.
And I feel as we could engage with that and maybe enrich that, because that has been used in a very specific domain.
Yeah.
Whereas you could actually sort of take it to a completely different domain altogether.
So I'll say just a couple of words because I don't want to tell you my time is up. So not just Turkey, but Jordan and Lebanon, I think, are classic cases to look at. So it's got to the point now where Jordan, which had always absorbed Palestinian refugees and now refugees from Syria, 1 in every 4 people is a refugee. Either was a refugee, or is the child of a refugee, or is a recent refugee. Right? And again, we're talking about countries that are extremely resource constrained, but because of their proximity to the crisis, have had no choice but to absorb people in. Now, does the question of them being co-ethnics, and I don't mean co-ethnics as much as perhaps a religious question of being fellow Muslims matter? I think it does. But I think this is where the Malaysian case also is very important. So Malaysia does take in people from all over the world, but particularly Muslims, and from areas that they think are important. But they don't give them rights, as I've said before. But yet they use that absorption, they use that inclusion in, for example, the Organization of Islamic Conference to say, look how well we're doing in terms of our fellow Muslims around the world. So there's a level at which they can get political leverage advantage from saying that we're being inclusive, even as domestically, they're saying, okay, we're drawing the line in terms of who's in and who's out. So governments, that's why I don't want to be romantic about governments, and that's why my focus is very much on, on civil society and non-governmental organizations, because they operate from a different set of principles altogether. The political society question is a great one, because for those of you who don't know, it's a term that's used to describe the relationships of those who lack rights in a formal sense, but who can make a claim on the, if you will, on the, what should I say, on a set of resources which have to do with morality and public ethics. In other words, you can say that, look, I don't have any rights, but don't throw me out from the place I'm living in, because I'll have no place to go, and the person in charge or the person in authority says, I feel sorry for you, or I recognize that you're a human being even if you don't have rights, and I won't trouble you and I won't disturb you, right? So that gap where the subject, the person standing in front of you, lacks formal rights, but nonetheless is recognized as being equally human and then hence constitutive a certain degree of mutual relationship or affection, is what this scholar refers to as political society. Something like that is certainly taking place in these regions, because asylum seekers by definition in Southeast Asia don't have rights in a formal sense. Nonetheless, they're not being refouled, they're not being sent back to their place of origin, they're not being looked after necessarily very well. So I don't again want to romanticize this, but I do want to suggest that they are given a certain degree of recognition as fellow human beings with, you might say, what might be called tacit rights rather than formal rights, and hence are treated in a certain kind of way. They're very much subject to geopolitical change. So we will see, for example, in a couple of years, when the Rohingya crisis settles down, by which I mean we forget about it, because the crisis is still very much there, but we stop talking about it. At that point, the attitude of police and local officials and others towards them, whether in Indonesia or Malaysia, will change.
Let me ask first, is Professor Yong here? Jean Yong? Okay, very good. Okay, so I think that's all the time we have for the first speaker, but thank you.